although we need to be honest and truthful in terms of what our government, etc., is giving, I also believe in hope. And for me, we've got a constitutional project. This democracy does not belong to a political party. It does not belong just to government. It belongs to the people. And so it is important for each one of us to ensure that this democratic project does not fail.
Seehaam, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about women in the legal profession. We celebrate 100 years of women in law this year in South Africa, and we have come a long way. And today we want us to reflect on your journey as a woman in the legal profession. So let's start at the beginning. Why did you choose law?
Thank you very much for having me. I chose law to be able to ensure that there is a voice for women as well as the marginalized. And it comes from my history of where I come from. I came from a small little area which is called Boerkaap. And historically, it was a Malay quarters. And it was the only, I would say, area of color within the broader city center. And we know that comes from our apartheid past. Growing up in the area was in the, I would say in the early 80s, late 90s, which meant that that was my teenage years and being on school, which was also the time of the mass democratic movement as well as the UDF. Now, obviously, I was too young, but what I experienced was those activists that used to teach us and used to come into our area and used to make us conscious around a range of things. And I'm talking about in early 1990s, we used to learn about HIV, AIDS, etc., which was not really happening in most of the Cape Flats. And in addition to that, my family comes from civic politics, which means that we were always told to give back. I was always seen as somebody that academically was okay and to be able to partake that. So I used to teach and tutor from a very young age, my entire high school career. And within that, it was to be able to ensure fundamentally for me that education is so important because it will give you freedom. And so whatever I had in terms of knowledge, I loved to be able to just give that. And so that was in my early ages. After that, I went to UWC, which just continued my activist consciousness because I became a student of what they call street law. And this was in the early 1994, and I would always say in my career, not in my student life, I literally had the old constitution, the new constitution, and also, the final constitution. So this was in my 5 years of study. And so it was a very exciting time for me at UWC because it was about voter education, it was about democracy, it was about teaching communities to go and vote, etc. And we were a group of law students that was exceptionally, I would say, creative. We used the arts, we used media, we went on Bush radio, etc., to be able to give a consciousness in the communities around what is coming in terms of elections. And so for us, it was an opening for me as a child of Boerkaap to be able to travel in the entire Western Cape. And these are the opportunities that UWC also gave me, going into the deep rural areas and to be able to go teach human rights. So therefore, it was I transitioned then. There's a course which they called a law clinic in the faculty, and it was how to teach law through a practical application and to teach law students social justice. And I was in that course for a year, and it was very important because they then exposed me to organizations like the Legal Resource Center, Lawyers for Human Rights, and big law firms. I then went, because I never saw myself as going to a private law firm and working within corporate. My consciousness has always been around human rights and wanting to build our country, in a constitutional state. And I went to Legal Resource Center, which was one of the biggest human rights law firms in the country. I did my articles there and met phenomenal lawyers and was taught in public interest litigation. After that, I went to Lawyers for Human Rights and worked on the farms and with advice officers, which for me was very important because it rooted access to justice within those communities. And for me, it was important to build those advice officers, teach. And after Lawyers for Human Rights, I came back to UWC, which was I would say, to be able to teach law students around social justice, public interest litigation, activist lawyering, all of that. And I then went back to UWC and became the director of the law clinic after having been there for about 3 years being a lawyer in what they call the Cape Human Rights Cluster, which provided legal services through the law clinics with advice officers in as far as Worcester, Boland, Ceres, and to be able to ensure that there's access to justice. Being a director of the law clinic, I then started facilitating a broader movement of law clinics. There's 21 law clinics in the country. And it was very important for me to ensure that the law clinic became a pedagogy within the university, because they always saw, I would say, the law clinic as an adopted baby. We do practice and theory separate. Whereas for me, being at UWC, which the root of UWC was always to develop communities. It was about human rights, it's about access to justice. It was important for me to be able to ensure that there is in the curriculum of UWC a consciousness of how we teach students about social justice. I became the president of law clinics in this country and started spearheading that movement, not just in this country, but also in the region. And we had very close relationships with Nigeria and different global countries like Poland, etc., to be able to help them to also become what they call that time a AULI, an association of university legal aid institutions. Driving AULI, and I'm very proud because I left in 2012, and I would say I decided to give my hand at government. And I decided to, and during this period also at UWC, lots of opportunities. I had a dean that really believed in women. And I just wanted to say also that I had a daughter at the age of 19 at UWC. And what I always loved about UWC was the integration. I was allowed as a young mother to also bring my daughter and to be there because there was a creche. There was a consciousness of young women and wanting to ensure that they get their degrees. And that support was there. Even with my dean, when I had my second child, she was very conscious around maternity and ensuring that there's an environment which is conducive for children even within the law clinic. I left UWC and I went to the government, which I became the director of legal services within the province, which meant that I had to manage with my other directorates 54 courts. And here it was to be able to see whether or not I could instill those principles into the legal system within our domestic violence courts, sexual offences courts, maintenance court, to be able to make it more victim-centred, to ensure that we follow what the Constitution says in ensuring that the courts are safe spaces. And I did that, but I think the calling for civil society was great. I could see I had my stint at government. I truly believed in an accountable state, and I thought that my experience going back and having learned now also how government operates, etc., that I can go back to civil society to be able to partake that. And then I worked for Foundation for Human Rights, which was a funder organization, and also work very closely with human rights organizations and civil society to ensure that there is socioeconomic development, etc., within our communities. And then after that, I came back, into the sector, which is the gender sector to Women's Legal Centre. And I started here in 2016. And to be able to ensure that the centre becomes a true African feminist legal centre. Although we've been in existence for the past 28 years, we had to ensure that even the WLC transforms, that it's led by Black women, that we ensure that it reflects what society reflects in this country. And that transformation agenda I drove since 2016. And so you can see this is the center. We develop a feminist jurisprudence. We develop feminist litigation. We ensure that the work that we do is to be able to bring about substantive equality for women, not just formal, not just law, but to be able to ensure that women in all their aspects are given equality. And we know that as feminists, we feminist litigators, we know that the law is not always neutral, because it was never developed for what the Constitution also envisaged for women and envisaged for what our court should be. It should be a dignified space, a space where there's justice, a space where there's equality. And for us is to be able to ensure that when we litigate, that the system works for women on the ground. And in the center, we have 5 different programs where we believe that these 5 programs will broadly ensure equality for women within the workplace, within the home, within society. And to be able to develop that, we also know that the courts is not the place for social change, although we can use it for social change, but it's not the place, because we need to be able to empower our communities to be able to navigate their own lives. And how does that look? Which is why we come with our activism part. So we're feminist activist lawyers, because we believe that we need to educate. We need to educate women around their rights. We need to be able to ensure that they can take their own life into their and bring changes through skills and support that we can give. And so we do what they call Know Your Rights, education. We do strategic litigation. We also go to Parliament. We make submissions around policies, and the lens that we use is a feminist lens, and it's an intersectional lens. It's an intersectional lens because we want the courts as well as institutions to take into account how race, gender, sexual orientation all impacts on the decision making and the lived realities of women and how they make decisions. And we want the courts to be able to take that into account.
All right. I will get now. You have a lovely jacket on, and I see the vision, the African feminist vision. I'll touch on that a little bit later on, but you have an amazing journey, as you have outlined. This journey, and there might have been a lot of lessons along the way. So, what is one of the key lessons that you can take from this particular journey as a woman? What would the conversation be like for a younger you?
With regard to a younger me, I would say continue on the path of ensuring that your goals are achieved, because there are many things in life where the river of life just takes you. But to be able to be focused, to be able to be disciplined, and to be able to build resilience, because you will get many, many obstacles that you, whether or not you're a young mother that is on university, that has to navigate, and you know that your friends and everybody is having, for example, fun. You can have, but it is how you do it. And it's very important to be able to find institutions that resonates with who you are, like the street laws, like institutions where you'll be able to give back, because it brings immense let me just think, it brings immense satisfaction to you to be able to use the law and to be able to partake and share that and see how people develop. But one thing that I would say is that you need to find balance in terms of your health, in terms of mental health. And it's very important for you, which I didn't. And if you continue, because the resilience also over time, you tend to just continue and not think of yourself. And it's very important that you have self-care. And you need to be able to believe in yourself, even though no one else believes in what you're going to do. I was exceptionally focused on university, and in terms of ensuring that I get the degree, because I had to work, I had a child, I was married, etc. And all of those things intersect with why I thought it was so important to finish that degree and to be able to get into the work environment. I didn't have the privilege to what they call go on a gap year. I have never not worked since university. And I think that if you want, for me, I would say, and I'm trying to have now in my life more self-care and to be able to ensure that you are much more conscious around my work balance, even though it's exceptionally difficult in terms of the work that you do. And when you build that in, you'll be able to go much further. Yeah.
Yeah, so I love it. I love it that the message that you would give to a younger you is a message of self care, because currently it seems like the whole world is in this hustle, overwork, 12 hours a day, type of mode. But there's so little that people have to say about self-care. So I think it's an important message for especially young women,
Yes.
and not just young women. There's young boys also out there
Yes.
that needs to know that they have to protect their mental health, because if they don't do it, then they're going to be exploited. But you also been an educator,
Yes.
so you taught at UWC. Where does this interest in teaching come from? And do you think that teaching molded you for your current role, but also the many roles that you occupy?
Yes, I do believe that me being a lecturer, a teacher, has always been inherent in me before I even started the law degree. And I think it was shaped by um, our political environment. Like I said before, mass democratic movement, I teachers that came from like organizations or form part of the UDF. And so teaching has always been teach one, there was a slogan, each one, teach one. And it was something that was instilled in me from school. I was chairperson of the SRC, and to be able to ensure that understanding that the system was oppressing us, and how do we move above that system. And so for me it was always, how do I come above the system? And so my father and my family was very much into getting students, even at they had a, what did they used to call it? There was an institution at UWC where you could go and test what you should study. I'm talking about many years. My daddy had, like, my father had this bucky, and we just used to load all my friends so that they could get conscious of universities and what is out there. That is what we used to do. And so it was a natural progression for me to go to university, but I was also the first generation of my family, with my brother. So my two brothers and myself were the first generation that went to university and actually got a degree. My mom went out in standard 5, but I would think that she was, very intelligent, and obviously because of her own socioeconomic and circumstances, she couldn't go to high school. My dad was a bricklayer, and he obviously, we know that time they used to go outside at 8, but used to go to school. So education was very important in our family. Um, and so being in the first generation, there was always a consciousness for me to get other people in my community to be on the same level that I and that my brothers and I were on. Um, and going to university, there wasn't a lot of my friends from school that went, and I obviously made new ones. And then joining street law. And if you look at street law also, it was about teaching. Going back to UWC, naturally, for me, it was about teaching that social consciousness, about rooting communities and in the work that you are doing, and how do you give back. So that is what I did. So I think maybe I was a teacher first before a lawyer. And I think inherent in being an activist was teaching. And so, yeah, it's to be able to just bring all of those together: teaching, lawyering, being in the community.
I couldn't agree more. Is that being an activist is being to teach, break down complex concepts, and make that concepts then understandable to people,
Yes.
and through that then people can access their rights, but they can also teach.
Yeah.
Because if they, a friend of them
Yeah.
encounters the same, then they are also able to teach. But you did a master's, and your
Yes.
master's was on land evictions. One of the places that you still find land evictions is a lot, in the Western Cape,
Yes.
and a lot of people doesn't access their rights. So
Yeah.
it clearly seems that you are on the side of the marginalized, and you consider yourself as a feminist lawyer.
Yes.
Where does this come from?
I think my, I think without even knowing what feminism in theory and what it actually meant, I'm talking about at school. Um, I always think that I was a feminist, in terms of at school, always pushing for equality, always pushing for those that are marginalized, also having a consciousness of systems and how, even being in my own family, having two boys and a girl, being treated differently. And so those are all things that I used to look at. And it used to stand out, and for me it wasn't okay, because girls that became pregnant, girls that used to was at a young age, got married, etc., education was completely taken out. And for me, it was education was so important. And these were all principles which, much later in my life, when I came to university and started working, when I started reading around bell hooks and reading around most Crenshaw, all of these feminists, writers, and which started informing my own consciousness around equality, a right to bodily integrity, all of those things. And what does that mean? And how, because I honestly believe that feminism is the alternative, obviously, for me in terms of patriarchy, and feminism is for me a system that brings in equality. It's not about women versus men, it's about a system that speaks to inclusivity, a system that speaks to equality, and a system that ensures that humans and people are centered in relation to decision making that we are. So we could see that women are disproportionate. So I think in my activism, I became a feminist. And I had many women in the communities that you think, we always used to say, people used to say I just speak too much and I'm loud and etc. But I always say those are women that I voice, and I always looked up to those women because they took the power into their own hands and they um, shifted systems, shifted decision making. And I've always seen women in our communities as organizers, as those that is almost like the backbone of the home. Um, and if you take that woman out, who's going to feed? Who's going to ensure you're going to school, etc.? All of those things and those patterns I saw is, I didn't know obviously at that time, it's what they called unpaid care work, but there was just for me an unfairness around how the even our families and our societies operated in relation to women.
So there's definitely a conversation that we need to have in the future about unpaid care work, and there needs to be kind of a justice and a conversation about justice that needs to take place, and especially a kind of intergenerational justice when it comes to unpaid care work.
Care work.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I agree 100% with you. But apart from the unpaid care work, women also are not that much in leadership, executive leadership positions. And you were fortunate enough to occupy some of those spaces. I want your take on it. How important and what is the importance of women in these executive leadership positions?
Yes. What we have seen in the legal profession is that we have more women law students, more women candidate attorneys, but the attrition rate of women moving into the sector and into broader management, something is happening. And that something is the environment, it's the hegemony. It is the environment where patriarchy also rules in terms of the boardroom. And it's very important for women to be in that boardroom. But I also think that we must not, as we move up, must not start emulating the principles of, I wouldn't say men, but what patriarchy taught them. And we have got a big task as women. Firstly, we need to get a seat. Then we need to let our voices be heard. Then, thirdly, we need to change the environment. Because the old boys club, golf, drinking after hours, going to certain networking events. Whereas women with their care responsibilities, women with not working in a flexible environment, have to start emulating what have been placed there. And how do you change that environment in the workplace? Because maybe certain religions don't drink, or certain religions don't partake on a Saturday. And so we must be conscious of diversity and how we ensure that not just women, but diverse genders' voices are heard, which is also broadly the LGBTI community. And how do we ensure that that boardroom starts reflecting what's happening on the ground? And that is very difficult. And for women who they call trailblazers, I would say women that have gone, it's difficult because they have to hold, and sometimes they become what they called femocrats, feminists, but having to work within a bureaucratic system and to be able to navigate that. And I always say that it's numbers that's going to change that. How is it possible that we are more than 51%, but we're 3% in the boardroom? We are the majority. And so how do we start reflecting that? And many people ask, and men ask, now what do we do? How do we ensure that this inclusivity? You see, the position is also linked to hegemony. It's also linked to power. It's linked to a range of things. And I always say that power doesn't just give. Power you have to take. And many people don't like that. The sharing business, it's 30 years on, they haven't shared. And so, what does that look like? How do we ensure? Because many people don't want to do, for example, the percentages, etc. There's a place and a space for it, because people are not going to willingly give up.
So I agree with you. Representation do matter. If the numbers is there and there's something off with the representation, then attention needs to give to representation, because representation do matter. In our constitution, I think part of in the preamble say united in our diversity. So it's one of the things that we really have to give attention to is what does it mean to be united in diversity. And I don't think in South Africa we have even start to unpack what it means, because then you start thinking about inclusive. So if we have this event, then it's not just a certain group. It's like, no, we're excluding some people. So we have to go above and beyond to
Include people. There must
exactly.
be consciousness around creating space.
Exactly. So let's turn our eyes now to 100 years. This year we celebrate 100 years of women in law. But the Ian Ferris at the event in Europe, we say, she already said this is not a celebration, this is an accusation. Um, but let's
Let's go.
let's reflect.
Let's in
Another 100 years, how does it look?
100 years across the world, I do think that more possibly could have been done, but a lot have been put in place. And I think let's not forget. We need to continue with the struggle, but let us remind ourselves. We started 1923, it was a white woman. Then it was Desiree Finker that came much later in the 60s. With Sissy Gould was also important. And so even it's 100 years for women, but it's only 40 years for black women. And we need to be able to contextualize all of that. But if you look at what has happened is that we do have a right of appearance. We can go to court. And there is a lot of post 94, a lot of policies have been put in place to ensure that there's equity in terms of implementation, in terms of policy. But it's the implementation that's the problem. And besides implementation, it's to be able to change the environment. But how do we do that? And I do think that with our constitution that prioritizes equality, prioritizes dignity, etc., it shows a vision of gender transformation, and it's something that we need to aspire to. And how do we make that constitutional vision of gender transformation a reality? And the state has put in a lot, but more needs to be done. As we can see that women, the attrition rate is still very high. We don't see women being, for example, the directors. We need more empowerment activities for women. We need proper structured mentorship for women. Also understanding that those women that are mentors might also just be first generation mentors, and they also need support. And how do we ensure that the legal profession becomes inclusive? That we need to look at the wage gap. We need to look at maternity leave and benefits. Remember, many people are working, they're sole practitioners. At the bar, for example, remember, it's all sole practitioners. What has the bar put in place? What has the institutions put in place to ensure? Because it's one thing to say transformation. You need to put the money to the transformation. Because every time we need to compete, there needs to be a consciousness in terms of budgets, etc., to be able to ensure that women and also other genders are given the space to be able to move forward.
So you just a moment ago talked about 30 years. So, and we know how the role of women in South Africa have been neglected, especially in the narrative, the national narrative,
Yes.
when it comes to the liberation struggle. So, I want you to reflect on will our democracy last another 30 years? Because next year we celebrate 30 years of a democracy, but we know currently that there's a lot happening. So,
I am. There's a lot going on, and I can become exceptionally negative. But although we need to be honest and truthful in terms of what our government, etc., is giving, I also believe in hope. And for me, we've got a constitutional project. This democracy does not belong to a political party. It does not belong just to government. It belongs to the people. And so it is important for each one of us to ensure that this democratic project does not fail. And so I'm going to say, I believe that we have proper institutions and our democracy is going to survive. It's going to survive in a way where our courts are working. Our courts have ensured that we vindicate rights. Our courts have ensured that our constitutional framework remains at the center in terms of decision making in courts. And I also, it's not just the courts, we do have parliament and we have the executive. And I do think that even just 30 years, we must become a much more vibrant democracy and continue being that beacon of hope, even in the world. And I think many people are saying, what hope? Where? What? I'm saying, don't let the government take that hope away. You need to vote. You need to be able to become active citizens. You need to keep your government accountable. And we did it during the 80s and 90s. It might have been rent boycotts. It might have been people coming out. And we do have that also now. People asserting their rights. If you look at in South Africa, we do have some of the highest marches and protests. But what does that reflect also? It reflects a vibrant democracy. So people mustn't look at there's a lot that needs to happen. We need homes. I also believe in the Freedom Charter, and there will be homes, there will be schools, there will be education for all. So what does that mean? That Freedom Charter is the aspirations of a movement. And how do we, as lawyers 30 years later, continue building that democratic state?
so I agree with you. We've come a long way. We must never lose hope. And that the government, our hands, our democracy is not in the hand of the government or any political party. The people shall govern.
People shall govern.
I'm with that. So we've come a long way. There is hope. I have hope. But the one thing that kind of leave me sometimes hopeless is the violence against women and children. And I know, as a political studies scholar, that violence started on this shore in Cape Town with a slave woman, with a Khoi woman. And we know a few of those names of those women, but there's so many women that perishes. They not even mentioned in legal documents when there was rape cases put into. They were nameless when they put in. The men become, but the victim doesn't get a name into it. So my question is then, how do we deal? How do we deal with gender-based violence in South Africa in the next 30 years?
Violence in South Africa is a serious challenge and pandemic. And we do have the National Strategic Plan Against Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. That document was a document also of struggle. And I know that it's just on paper, but what I want to say is civil society and government in 2016, 17, when it was the 2018, when it was the total shutdown. I want to explain to you the history, because it's not just there's work that's being done, but we know that there is a problem. But what are we doing? So in the total shutdown, even in 2018, etc., pushing for the 24 demands. And these were just not civil society. These were ordinary women on the ground saying, we had enough, and keeping the president accountable. And more needs to be done, but civil society and government has now formed I would say an alliance to be able to drive this national gender-based violence strategic the plan. And we as civil society must keep government accountable to that plan, because we're saying that plan is going to help us to bring down the violence in this country. Now, I can go into all the problems. 59,000, between 57 and 59,000 sexual offences. That's high. Not even in war countries you have that levels of sexual violence. And so we need to continue engaging also with government, etc., around those numbers and what does that reflect, and to ensure that there's a higher amount of of offenders that are being found guilty, that is convicted. And so the conviction rates, it's still very low, even though government says it's high, at 7%. And with civil society, we must continue working together as a collective. And it's difficult because we work in silos, not because we want to. It's also because many of us, there are so much work that you don't have time for collaboration. You don't have time to be able to connect. And I think that when we connect and we collaborate, we start sharing the burdens, and we can carry ourselves collectively through. And so I've said a lot in terms of, I know there's a lot in this office. Obviously, we are suing government also around the failure of systems. But what I want you to think about is that we have a court and we have a process to be able to keep government accountable, even though the courts is not the space where it should be, but at least it's a last resort, that there is not nothing, and that we can take the constitution and keep government accountable. Those things we need to keep, and institutions like the Gender Commission, the Chapter 9s, which is the South African Human Rights Commission, etc., all of those, which are institutions created to uphold our democratic state, we need to use. And we need to ensure that government gives them more money, and to be able to ensure that they function properly. And we shouldn't make those institutions political battles. And we need to know that the people that are there and the commissioners are people with integrity, that they are accountable, and civil society need to ensure that that happens. And how do we, I just don't want to go into the complete negative. We need to take all the institutions and keep government accountable, because we've got all the policies. We have one of the best constitutions in the world. We've got the best policies and legislation, etc. But how do we get more lawyers to be able to do this work? How do we continue instilling in lawyers a social consciousness? Because what I've seen is, I see there's actually a reduction. That there isn't a social consciousness on students. That students go in and it's all about them and I and the what the law can give in terms of materiality. And I know that everybody is not going to become a human rights lawyer. But what I do want is, it's a consciousness. And this is what I told my students. Even if you go to the big law firms or be in a small law firm, if you do a merger and acquisition, or even if you do a labor matter, be conscious when you retrench. Be conscious when you evict. Be conscious when you attach. Be conscious to the socioeconomic and don't abuse our people. Because we are not all going to become human rights lawyers. But it's to be able to understand, don't forget where you come from. Now that is a lot for a black child.
I agree.
That's a lot for a black child. And sometimes people say, how do you put that onto the black child too? That is where I come from, and I know it's a lot. All I'm saying is, black child should be able to go back into their communities and build. And we need to help them. Because no matter, we will always be connected. And that keeps us, and this is again to the younger self, stay rooted in your community. Stay rooted in your family. Because that keeps you sane when everybody else either don't believe you or you're a little bit off your goals.
Let's turn our attention to one more last question. And you've talked about your younger self, but there's young women out there that need a message. They might be busy now with their studies. They might be in high school, considering coming to study law. What would the message that you would give them, having walked this and have seen this road that is so dominated by men?
Yeah. I would say to those who are young women, understand your worth. Continue on your path of being your authentic self. It's difficult. But continue on that particular path. Ensure that, this is for me, in all the hardships, be kind to yourself. And also, when hardships come, be kind even to your enemy. I've learned this very, very late. But it's practices that will take you through, and it will ensure that the throws that life gives you don't take you off your path. But also, stay bold, stay loud, and continue making your voice heard, even under the hardest times.
Seehaam, thank you very much.
Now that was...
UWC is proud of you. When the names come out, yours is almost like everyone in the community said. like you must be one of the people they would like to hear. So from UWC, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you also for UWC for I always say that we need to commemorate people. We need to, tell them these things during their lifetime and not when they're dead.